Hello everyone, it's good to be here. So in 2007, I was in Jerusalem. One day I went up to the Mount of Olives, which is on the eastern side of the city. And I went up a church tower called the Church of the Ascension. And from this church tower, I could see all of Jerusalem. I could see this entire iconic city. There we go. I could see the old city. I could see the Dome of the Rock. I could even see out into the desert towards the Dead Sea. But I also saw this. This gray concrete wall slicing through large swaths of the city. Now, I had heard of this wall. Israel had begun building it a few years before, and they were building it in order to separate Jerusalem, Israel, and many Israeli settlements from Palestinian areas of the West Bank. And this wall was very controversial, both because it involved lots of land appropriation and because of the impact it had on the people who lived near the wall, who were now often separated from their homes, from their workplaces, from their friends and family. It was one thing to hear about this wall in the abstract. It was another thing to see it laid out in front of me like this. So I started thinking about this. This stuck in my mind. And part of the reason it stuck in my mind is that recently I had also been to another city that was famous for its wall, Berlin. Now, in Berlin, the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. So for Berlin, the wall was in the past. It was just some graffiti-covered slabs that were kept as commemorative objects or reminders of the folly of the past. Indeed, in Berlin, the conversation about the wall was all about how to move beyond it and how to move into a future of unity and peace. And this idea of tearing down walls or moving into a more borderless world is something that we've heard lots and lots about in the past 25 years, ever since the end of the Cold War. In fact, especially in the 90s, which was a time of relative peace and prosperity, this idea was everywhere. It seemed pretty much inevitable. Suddenly, it became possible to travel from one end of Europe to the other without having to deal with any borders or showing your passport. This was unprecedented for a continent that had for centuries torn itself apart in bloody wars and conflict. At the same time, globalization was becoming a phenomenon. It was becoming much easier and faster to move people, goods, and information around the world. And people looked at all of these changes and saw something fundamental, something transformative happening. One scholar famously called this the end of history. And by this he meant that the idea that the types of conflicts and wars that had characterized much of human history were fading away, and that democracy was triumphing and was inevitably going to spread throughout the world. At the same time, other people were talking about these global flows of information and goods and looking at how this affects the notion of the nation state and national borders. And in fact, many people saw the demise, or at least the demotion, of the power of individual states and the importance of their borders to be replaced by international confederations or multinational corporations. Conflict and parochialism were seen as the past, and globalization and democracy were the future. Now, it didn't quite turn out that way, totally. And the single event that called this narrative of progress into question was the September 11th attacks, where all of a sudden we were faced again with a long war or quasi-war or a series of conflicts that took over much of the world. And this also exposed some of the risks to this more open, less border-centric world. When people and goods can flow freely from place to place, it also makes it easier to stage international attacks and acts of terrorism. And we see the risks even more clearly today, 14 years later. We can see it in all kinds of things. We can see it in the ability of hackers to stage cyber attacks from halfway across the world, or in the ability of drones to strike with little regard for national borders or sovereignty. But this doesn't mean that this idea of lessening borders or opening borders went away. It just took on a darker tone. So when I was standing here in Jerusalem in 2007, I was thinking about this, and I kept thinking how strange this wall was, how out of place, how bizarre it was that the whole world seemed to be moving away from this. And here, in this place, there was this new wall separating people and becoming the kind of symbol of another conflict. But as I was thinking of this, my initial thought was, oh, how strange and foreign. What a weird place that this is happening. And this is actually a common idea that we hear a lot about the Middle East, right? We hear the Middle East is this kind of incomprehensible place that is somehow fundamentally different from the rest of the world. And we see this in the way that we talk about the religion of Islam, for example, or the way we talk about politics in the Arab world. And this idea has a very long history. We've seen this for centuries in the way that the Middle East has been exoticized in the West. So I started to think further, and I started to question my initial assumption. I started to think more about this idea of borders and the role that they play. Was this wall that I was seeing here just an anomaly, or was it something more? Was it something that we could learn from? And so I started reading about borders both in this specific context and more generally, and I found a number of things. One of the most important takeaways that I got was that we should understand borders not simply as lines on a map, but as spaces that are lived in experience, places that people negotiate and encounter in their daily lives and that are huge parts of their lives. And so once I started to think about this, I began to see the wall that I saw here in Jerusalem not simply as a strange exception, but as perhaps a more explicit or more extreme manifestation of things that are going on in lots of places across the world. And so what I want to do for the rest of this talk is to take you through a few examples of how looking at these types of borders in the Middle East can help us understand things that are going on elsewhere in the world, and what are some of the broader meanings of this. I want to start not with the wall itself, but actually with the place where you go through the wall, the border crossing or the checkpoint. This is taken from a checkpoint called Qalandia that lies between the Palestinian city of Ramallah and Jerusalem. And I passed through this many times, and I took this picture at one point, and you can kind of get a sense of what it looks like. And one of the things that I noticed very quickly going through these checkpoints is how disproportionately they affect some people while leaving others relatively unscathed. As an American, I was relatively privileged. It was relatively easy for me to cross, but that's not true for everyone. One day I was traveling from Bethlehem to Jerusalem, which required me to pass through a different checkpoint and to go from one side of the wall to the other. I was on a Palestinian bus, and we pulled up to the checkpoint, and we were all told to get off and stand by the side of the road so that our IDs could be checked. And this took about 30 minutes, which may not sound in the grand scheme of things like that long, but in fact, if you consider that Bethlehem and Jerusalem are only a few miles apart, it actually adds a significant portion to the journey. And many of the people on the bus take this route every single day, so it adds up very quickly. But the whole time that I was standing there waiting to get back on our way, I saw bus after bus and car after car pass through the checkpoint without stopping, going also to Jerusalem. And it turns out that Israeli buses or cars with Israeli license plates did not have to stop here. They just went right through the checkpoint with no problem. And I would suspect that for a lot of people in those vehicles, they had little or no awareness that they were actually passing from one side of the wall to the other. The border for them was invisible. But for us, and especially for the people who were on this bus and take this bus every day, it was all too tangible and all too real. So I think it's helpful to think of borders not simply as blockages, but as this kind of filter that lets some people through and doesn't let other people through. But what does this mean for this? How do we make sense of this in light of the discussion of open borders that I mentioned earlier, especially in Europe, where you can go from Spain to Norway, for example, without encountering a border checkpoint? Well, it turns out that even these open and these unseen borders, or these invisible borders, can actually reassert themselves. So one day I was traveling from Germany to the Netherlands in 2006, and I was on a train, and the train crossed the border into the Netherlands and suddenly came to a stop unexpectedly. And these border guards came on and fanned through the train and checked everyone's IDs. And a few minutes later, I saw them escort a family off the train at the next stop, presumably to send them back to Germany. They were denied entry into the Netherlands. So much for open borders, right? So I want to think of this, when we hear about open borders, I want us to think of this as a relative concept, something that's contingent on time and place and is never really absolute. And in fact, we see a lot of times that borders tend to self-perpetuate and they tend to reproduce themselves. So if an open border is never really fully open, what does this mean for a closed border? And in fact, I found something similar, that closed borders also are never really fully closed. Even the most tense and secure border has some way to pass through, whether sanctioned or not. Some people are able to get from one side to the other. There's a film called Mirror, which is the French word for wall. Excuse my terrible French pronunciation. And it's directed by a French-Israeli filmmaker named Simon Biton. And this chronicles the construction of the wall in the West Bank, the wall that I showed you earlier in Jerusalem. And it also shows how this wall has negatively impacted the people who live near it. There's one section of the film where the director interviews the Israeli official who is in charge of building the wall. And he goes on and on about how wonderful this wall is and how effective it is and how it's using the latest technology and that there's no way that anybody can ever get through without them knowing and without being caught very quickly. But at the same time that we are hearing this official describe the wall in this way, we also see this picture or this shot of a man climbing through the barbed wire with very little difficulty and continuing on the other side. So the film is mocking this official's misplaced trust in his border. And it's telling us that no matter how high you build the wall or no matter how expensive your technology is, there's always going to be some way to get through. And we see this in a different example also, in the Palestinian territory of the Gaza Strip, which has been under blockade by Israel with the support of Egypt for many years. It's this tiny territory and it's very difficult to get in and out. So as a result, people have built tunnels that go from the Gaza Strip to the Egyptian side of the border to allow things to pass through. Originally, it was probably to smuggle weapons, but now they're used for all kinds of things, for food, for building materials, for people to pass through, sometimes even cars, and as we see in this photo, livestock. There's actually a story that came out a few years ago of a man who was running a KFC delivery service through the tunnels. He would take orders from customers and go to the Egyptian side to a KFC branch, pick up the food and bring it back to his customers in Gaza. Now these are kind of funny, but they underline a more serious point, which is that these tunnels exist because of severe deprivation in Gaza. And they also exist despite many, many, many strenuous efforts to get rid of them, or to destroy them, both by the Israelis and by the Egyptians. So the Israelis have launched countless raids and airstrikes against these tunnels over the past 8 or 9 years. And the Egyptians have been known, for example, to pour raw sewage down the tunnels to make them unusable, among other things. There's military forces use drones, ground-penetrating radar, et cetera, to try to find these tunnels. But every time the tunnels are destroyed, they're rebuilt. They're just rebuilt longer and deeper, and this kind of game of cat and mouse continues. So we see that the idea of a closed border is never really absolute. The border is never really fully closed. just as it's never really fully open. So we have to be skeptical of these claims. I don't have much more time, but to conclude, I want to go back to Jerusalem, to where I started on this journey of exploration about borders, and where I began to think about these issues. And in this kind of journey that I've had over the past 7 or 8 years, I've come to several conclusions, with the most important of which, and the one that I want to leave you with, is that you should be wary of any claims that borders are fully open, or that borders are fully closed, or that they're irrelevant, or that we are moving somehow to a borderless world. For while it may appear that way to a lot of people, and while a lot of people may experience the world in this kind of borderless, globalized way, there are a lot of other people for whom borders are all too real, who live stuck in the Gaza Strip, or live in refugee camps along the border, or live their daily lives in their shadows. And ignoring this doesn't really help it go away. So my point here is to pay attention to these kinds of things, to pay attention to borders. And there are lots of different ways you can do this. You can do this through personal travel and experience, like I've talked about here. You can do it through film. You can do it through geography, architecture, history. There's so many ways to approach the border, which really has a role in so many different means of understanding and of analyzing human experience. But the point is to look at the borders, not through them, and to remember that while for everyone who might experience the border as something that doesn't really exist or something that's invisible, there are many others who experience them as all too tangible places and all too tangible disruptions to their lives. Thank you very much.